Hi there. Right, so how did I find myself doing this? I found myself sort of exploring the world of work and the world of sort of work culture. I was interested in how we could be happier at work. And I think it's largely because I'd sort of told myself that I understood good working culture. And then I found over the course of time that really, work's changed so much in the last 10 years that I wasn't really aware of it. So I created this podcast. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, and it's called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And I guess what I've aimed to do through my discoveries there is to try and understand really how we can reform work. And to some extent, I've created a new work manifesto. So the new work manifesto, I've tweeted some of them out this morning. But the new work manifesto effectively is 8 points that I've learned through my insight and exploration of the way that work's evolved. Sort of you can see some of them there, but I'm going to go through a few of them now and sort of talk about the way I've really understood work. And principally, the thing I've learned is that work is evolving and our jobs are changing. And there's a lot of nonsense talked about the future of work. Often one of the first things that people reach for is they talk about automation and how automation's coming. Anytime I see stuff about robots, I think of this tweet here. The feeling when you realize the robots will steal your job. Okay, so let's look at some stats. So here's one fascinating stat. Since the advent, do you remember Bob Crow? Anyone who lives in London will be, or has sort of been connected with London, will know that Bob Crow was this incredible trade unionist who never let anything be added to the terms of work without a negotiation on it. Here's what we've allowed to happen in the last 10 years. Average working hours have gone up 27%. We've added 2 hours to the working day by adding email to our phone. It's this strange thing that we've all permitted email to permeate. Moments that you used to get your book out of your bag when you were travelling somewhere. You'd find yourself at lunchtime wandering to Boots and looking at the meal deal. Now we eat lunch al desco, and we find ourselves filling every moment with email. Work has got longer, 20% longer. In fact, half of all people report being exhausted at work. And that's largely a reflection of the fact that we operate on a cortisol-drenched, adrenalized attempt to check our emails all the time. The consequence of cortisol and adrenaline in the system is you end up at the end of the day feeling exhausted. There's a fascinating load of research. Gallup is the source for this. Gallup on their website have got lots of research about the workforce and how people work. And one of the most depressing things on the Gallup website is that 78% of people report going to work and shutting off, not being their real selves at work. They feel like they have to be an adapted version of themselves. And the final stat that I'll share with you is 1 in 5 people 1 in 5 sick days is stress-related. In fact, somewhere over a third of all of people report lying in bed awake with stress. So look, all of those things, I think, in aggregate, are a sign that work is becoming too much for us. There's an interesting piece of work by McKinsey that really tries to understand what's happened in the last 10 years. Now, McKinsey, I think, substantially underestimate this. They say that 30% of all work is email, and that computer work accounts for 50% of what we do in our jobs. But there's an interesting thing that's happened in the last 10 years. If those numbers are an underestimate, what you get is that in the last 10 years, there's been a transformation in the technology that we use as part of our jobs. Anyone who's been old enough to sort of have worked for 20 years or more will know that computers didn't permeate the office environment. So what you'd expect as a result of that increase in technology is you'd expect a big increase in productivity. Anytime that big technological change happens, normally productivity surges. And there's something called the productivity paradox. And here's the productivity paradox. It's over the last 50 years, the rate of growth has been pretty consistent. And in fact, I've put what you'd expect productivity should have grown at if it maintained the 1947 to 2001 level there. If it was just growing at the 2001 to 2007 level, it was there. But that's what productivity's actually done in the last 5 or 6 years, last 10 years. In fact, they're the US numbers. The UK numbers are even worse. Productivity hasn't gone up in the last 10 years. Right, so that's the overall summary. The summary is that email and computer work is accounting for half of all of our jobs. Productivity hasn't gone up as a result of that. So let's have a look at work culture and what's happening. The first thing is, here's some bad news. So when you start looking at culture and the way that we work, one of the things that becomes pretty clear pretty quickly is that this is all an exploration of neuroscience. This is all understanding how our brains work. And I've become fascinated and obsessed with a guy called Jack Pansep. Jack Pansep actually passed away this year, but he was a scientist who was famous for tickling rats. And what he found was that he said the human brain was identical in its construction in many ways to the general mammalian brain. And the way he demonstrated that is he said, I can produce the same emotions, the same reactions in rats as you would get in humans. Would you like to see him tickle rats? So here's what he did. He got a device which you would typically use to listen to bats, and he tuned it down a bit, and then he started tickling rats. I'll show you this because he became obsessed with it, and there's a point to this. So here is a rat. Now, I know what you were thinking. I'm not sure they were laughing. But here's what he did. So to demonstrate that the rats were absolutely loving that, he got the scientists to move their hands around. So here we go. You'll see here the rat chases the researcher around the pen. They were loving it, right? You take my word for it. Okay, so here's what Jack Pansep found. He found that there were seven states that the mind has. Seven sort of mindsets and motivations that the mind has. So rage, play, panic, mating. I'm going to talk about two of them here. So the bottom one is the one I'm particularly going to talk about. He found something called the seeking system, and that's especially relevant for anyone who's working here, who's in any way using their mind and creativity. The seeking system is our human or our mammalian desire to explore and to extend beyond the world that we currently live in. An example of this is orca killer whales, for example. So a mammal, orca killer whale, if you any animal that's higher up the food chain finds that their seeking system is more pronounced. And the orca killer whale, if you keep it in captivity, it sinks into a state of depression. In fact, such is the depression that killer whales have, that they live half as long in captivity as they do out in the wider world. So the seeking system is incredibly potent. And in fact, Jack Pansep, with his rats, he found that if you put rats into a cage, two rats into a cage with each other, within 5 minutes you observe about 50 episodes of them playing, of them exploring, of them sort of showing the traits that he would characterize as the seeking system. What he found, though, was that if you put a single piece of cat hair into the cage, they stop that completely. In fact, when you remove the cat hair, it takes them a long time to return to any sort of seeking, and they never achieve the same levels again. They never achieve in that cage the same levels again. Right, so why is that relevant? Because it means that anytime you've got any sort of fear, any sort of anxiety, any sort of panic that's in the environment that you're expecting creativity to be in, it's actually killed by it. So we find that actually there's a direct relevance to the way that we're working right now. The way that we're operating, the way that we're bringing sort of anxiety, stress into our working lives, we're killing our opportunity to be creative. So I guess the particular thing then when we're thinking about how we construct a work environment is how do we try and remove some of this stress, anxiety, and the demands upon us that are proving immensely difficult. And just looking at those things, I think it's pretty clear there's a lot of work that's been done on it. What strikes me, though, is that a lot of people who talk about culture are slightly removed from the people who've been exploring it and researching it. There's a piece of work here that was done by these two scientists. And they tried to understand, how can you tackle this productivity gap, and how can you try and adapt to the way that people are working? And they found that the only way that you're able to increase productivity, the only way that our minds were able to expand, was effectively you had to think about decentralizing, reorganizing, adapting the working day. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and give you some lessons of how we can adapt work to improve. Now, my obsession is happiness. And so before I sort of give you ways that we can improve work, full stop, there are two ways that you can be happier. And the two ways, the number one way to be happier is to sleep more. And so of all the people who claim they don't need a lot of sleep, according to the science, only 5% of those people are telling the truth. So generally getting somewhere between 7.5 and 8 hours is one of the surest ways to achieve happiness. The second way to achieve happiness, and look, we've got the weekend coming up, you might want to think about this, is to get happier friends. So you know, and what I'd say is we all operate a portfolio system with friends, don't we? We all have exposure to a number of things. And what I'd say is that dry, witty, sarcastic friend, that for me is a Wednesday night. And I'd invite you to, you know, that friend that you enjoy sharing a good bottle of wine, make sure it's 2 hours, you go home at the end of it. A friend that laughs and a friend who's got good warmth to them, that's a weekend friend. So I'm going to go through a few things. The critical things. A lot of people talk about culture, and I think to a large extent, culture really is all about thinking about the tone of companies and thinking about the way you work. So one of the things that you often hear companies talk about, and someone on my podcast described it as, I thought rather nicely, that you hear about the smoothie delusion. There's an interesting thing about perks and benefits that don't remotely correlate with people being happier at work, and they don't remotely correlate with better workforce cultures. So in fact, you know, anyone who's explored these things, these two forms of happiness, hedonic happiness, that sort of hedonism, going out, pleasure for pleasure's sake, that pleasure tends to be immensely short-lived, great fun while it lasts, don't get me wrong, and eudaimonic happiness. And eudaimonic happiness is that purpose happiness, that sort of things existing for a greater reason. Now, specifically on the smoothie delusion, here's an interesting piece of work, that employees who receive rewards for doing boring work demonstrate high levels of depression. So anyone you know who's got that gloriously well-paid job but just doesn't seem at ease with themselves, well, there's research to prove why that's the case. And in fact, perks and benefits just to try and improve a very, very drab job are probably the worst thing you can do. You should quit that job. So let me go through the examples. I've tweeted all of these out. Number one thing I think that we need to think about when we're thinking about reforming work is removing the need to have permission. I chatted to Joey Ito, who's the director of MIT Media Lab in the US, a place that's responsible for an immense amount of innovation. And he says that permission is one of the biggest restrictions to innovation. I chatted to someone recently, and I was asking them how they were working more flexibly. And they said, I don't know what I'm allowed to do. And it's strange, one of the things that you find consistently in the working environment is that even though we flatter ourselves and we say that we celebrate innovation and we celebrate change, we're scared to innovate with our own working life. One of the best books that you can read about the sort of the new world of work is Deep Work by Cal Newport. And he wrote this really... I mean, he's a prodigiously talented professor. Not only is he a tenured professor at the age of 35, he's written 5 books. And his work, Deep Work, really just talks to the fact that work, he thinks the way we're working now will be laughed at in 15 years. He said that broadly we've gamified work in a sort of an illusory way. So we get into, I've got to get emails down to 50. If I can get down to 30 emails before I go home. And there's nothing created by doing those emails. It's the illusion, it's shallow work. He said anytime that anything of substance is created, anytime that anything is created that adds value value to the world, it's deep work. It's where you need to concentrate. It's where you need to commit yourself to being in something of a state of flow. Now, the challenge of achieving a state of flow is that the open plan office isn't necessarily well suited to it. In fact, the open plan office is the enemy of getting anything done. And I know the challenge, and it's true, there's absolutely one of the worst thing that's happened in the last 20 years, 30 years, is the growth of the open plan offices. Interruptions, the things that most people report as causing them frustrations at work. Challenge of that, of course, is working from home the solution? And I accept it's been a bad year for working from home. There's definitely, it doesn't feel voguish to talk about working from home.
No, I would argue that this is a triumph of democracy. Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
That's right, carry on.
My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited.
So the aim of everyone in life is to become a meme, right? Walk into the club like, leaving the office like. If you look closely, you can actually pinpoint the exact moment he releases. So my point is this. So even though work from home might have a bad rep, actually trying to get some sort of, whether a workplace has a quiet carriage, whether a workplace has something that permits you to try and achieve a level of flow is a really important element to creating the future of work. Next point I want to make is that 40 hours is enough. And I think this is really critical because all of the evidence very strongly suggests the capacity of the human mind is 50 hours a week. In fact, you can actually make marginally more if you work up to 55 hours, but the marginal gain between 50 hours and 55 hours is minuscule. Actually, 40 hours is enough to do a job. If you look at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, they estimate that the average American does 3 hours work a day. Right, okay. So I'm doing 4. Right, look, if you accept you're doing marginally more than that, then it becomes, rather than like this notion, Marissa Mayer said that success that she'd seen at Google was defined by working 130 hours a week. There's no evidence for that at all. Once you accept that the capacity of the human mind is far smaller, then it's about, okay, when can I get myself in a good state to work and to achieve as much as possible? And one of those things is taking breaks and renewal. Tony Schwartz is a best-selling writer in the US, and he did something which he called Take Back Your Lunch. And thinking about how you can take a break and add to your sense of renewal is a really important part, firstly, of managing your energy, but also it's proven to increase your productivity. I'm going to give you 2 more examples, and this one I find to be particularly remarkable. This is a piece of work that a researcher from London Business School called Dan Cable did, and he did it. One of the best places to understand work culture and explore about the real world of work is often call centres, because you can look at a lot of data. And he worked with an Indian company called Wipro. They added a simple thing that's so simple and so almost trivial to their induction process that the results were remarkable. They added one exercise that was performed at the induction process, and it was a exercise performed in a group of people. They asked every new team to do this. So this is the exercise. This is all of the words are there. So they gave them this. They said, what's unique about you that leads to your happiest times at work? Reflect on a specific time when you were acting the way you were born to act. That's it. They then asked them in their groups to do those things. The results from just that exercise, so if this is a direction of travel, imagine how much more fully you could do this. The results from this exercise were remarkable. Not only was the happiness reported from those people's customers noticeably and significantly improved. It went up from 61% happy to 73% happy, so across their whole client set. But in addition, their retention at the firm increased by 57%. So just encouraging people to feel like they're not going to work to shut themselves off. They're not being an adapted version of their self. Permitting them to be a real version of themselves actually has a measurable impact. The final one I want to share is laughter. And I think this can be easily neglected. Often you find yourself in a work environment. If you've got those 130 emails a day that everyone gets, you're in a constant sense of trying to play catch up. And one thing that seems to be being crowded out of work environments is laughter. And I was particularly inspired when I spoke to this guy here, a guy called Alex Pentland from MIT. And he'd done some work, and he found, he got some of this, he used technology that we might be familiar with. He took effectively the insides of a mobile phone, and he turned the lanyard badges you're wearing today into a smart meter. And he tracked the interactions in people. What he was able to see was when I was talking to person A, if I then went to talk to person B, he could check whether it was questions I was asking. And he overlaid that in different office environments. And here's what he found. He found that chat directly correlated with workplace creativity. And that's particularly of interest, right? Because chat's the one thing with headphones and with the urgency that we've all got. Chat's the one thing that seems to be being crowded out of the way we work right now. So trying to find a balance between, yes, that deep work where you can work in silence, and then chat where you can try and achieve things and try and interact with each other seems the critical sort of root cause of creativity. So look, I don't know if I've got anything like the answer to what the way of work should evolve, but I think some of the things that are holding us back and preventing us from innovating are really potent right now. And so number one, giving people the permission to innovate and experiment with their workday seems really critical. Emphasizing that 40 hours is enough, reclaiming your lunch, permitting to people to be themselves, and allowing them to bring laughter to work. I don't have the answers. My podcast really is an attempt to try and explore and learn those things, and I think the route to improving work seems to be very rooted in science. Thank you very much.